We return to Socrates today, and we're going to delve a little deeper into his ethical principles. Let's remember that ethics is one of the most important parts of philosophy for Socrates because it deals with how one should live their own life, what kind of person is worth being. A word of caution, we are entering murky territory here because the dialogues where we see Socrates develop these ideas are no longer the early ones. It's not clear what belongs to Socrates and what belongs to Plato at this point. However, it seems fairly safe to assume that the foundations of these ideas are rooted in Socrates, and in any case, Plato was developing the assumptions of how Socrates lived his own life. If we were to summarize Socratic ethics in a fundamental principle, it would be this: committing injustice is bad and shameful. Bad should be understood here in a non-moral sense as harmful. Acting unjustly is self-harm. That's why Socrates can assert, to the astonishment of everyone else, that it is worse to commit an injustice than to suffer one. This statement is the cornerstone of all classical ethical reflection, from Socrates to Aristotle. It means that injustice should never, under any circumstances, be committed, not even in response to an injustice done to oneself. The dialogue in which Socrates most finely defends these ideas is the Gorgias. It's a long dialogue, but it's a gem. I highly recommend it. Furthermore, it is written with incredible passion, as if Plato, at the moment of writing it, was furious about something that had just happened to him. Socrates begins by arguing with Gorgias about whether rhetoric knows what is just and unjust. Since Gorgias cannot answer, he withdraws from the conversation, and a new interlocutor, a certain Polus, enters, who starts by saying that the unjust person is the happiest. However, Socrates demonstrates to him that it is impossible for the unjust to be the happiest because, in reality, the unjust person is a wretch, the most wretched of all, because committing injustices is the worst of evils, an evil that affects the soul, unlike other evils that affect only the body or physical integrity. Although the unjust person may subjectively appear happy in appearance, it is, in reality, the happiness of a fool and a scoundrel. This happiness is, in reality, a misfortune. It is not the best state a person can reach, but the worst. At this point, another character, Callicles, enters the fray, defending the right of the strongest, and begins to argue against everything Socrates is saying. With Callicles, the discussion takes on a very personal tone for Socrates because Callicles accuses him of making a fool of himself by engaging in philosophy at such an advanced age when philosophy is an activity for adolescents. Here, I imagine Socrates thinking, "Oh, really? I'm going to school you, young man?" For Callicles, it is necessary to distinguish between nature and law, a distinction that Socrates was not making. By nature, it is certainly worse to suffer an injustice, but by law, it is worse to commit one. However, since laws are established by the weak, it is, in reality, an illusion to oppress the strong and deny them the natural right to exercise their strength. For those of you who know a bit about philosophy, Callicles appears almost as a precursor to Nietzsche. Pay attention to this passage, which is almost a prophecy of the Superman. I believe that if there were a man with the right nature, he would shake, break, and evade all our laws and conventions, and trampling our writings, deceit, enchantments, and all laws contrary to nature, he would rise up and show himself master of all. And then, only then, will the justice of nature shine. Callicles is, therefore, asserting something that seems paradoxical. What is truly just for the strong is to commit injustice, to break the law. Socrates is not convinced and asks Callicles to define what he means by the strongest. Because at first glance, it might appear that if the multitude is capable of enslaving and oppressing the strongest, then the multitude is stronger than the strongest. Therefore, if justice according to Callicles is for the strongest to rule, then it is well. Callicles starts giving different answers that lead nowhere and ends up saying that the strongest and happiest are those who can give free rein to their passions. Socrates asks him how it can be that they are the strongest and happiest if they allow themselves to be enslaved and dominated by their passions. He will later accuse him of not distinguishing between good and bad pleasures and of directly equating pleasure with the good. From here, Callicles becomes angry, and Socrates has to continue his reasoning alone. Socrates will argue that there are pleasures that make a person better and pleasures that make a person worse. We must classify as bad pleasures all those that result from committing an injustice. But to do this, it is not enough to speak only of the body, we must also speak of the soul. Although committing an injustice may not have consequences for the body, or may even have good consequences because the unjust person gets more food, possessions, wealth, etc., committing an injustice has horrible consequences for the soul. Socrates says that injustice leaves marks on the soul, scars that twist it and make it ugly. Thus, he manages to identify the good with beauty once again. For Callicles, doing wrong could become something beautiful and admirable because it was a sign of a great and powerful soul. But for Socrates, this is no longer possible because doing wrong makes you ugly, it makes you ugly, even if that ugliness is not visible from the outside and is only internal or even dressed up as greatness. Socrates finishes with a myth: after death, when the soul separates from the body, all these marks become visible. The unjust person will appear in their true nature, and then no one can call what is actually ugly, twisted, and unfortunate beautiful, fortunate, or happy. The Gorgias is a particularly exciting dialogue if you read it with Socrates' death in mind. In fact, Plato puts several premonitory comments about his own death in Socrates' mouth, which at least give me goosebumps. But, to sum it up, the central idea of Socratic ethics is that committing an injustice is worse than suffering one. Attention, it's not that the one who suffers injustice is not miserable. Both the one who suffers injustice and the one who commits it are miserable, but the one who commits it is more miserable. You should not want either one, but if the choice ever arises between suffering an injustice and committing one, you should always prefer the suffering of an injustice without a doubt. The opposite implies not being aware of the terrible inner effects of committing an injustice. Almost everything that Plato and Aristotle later reflected on morality is implicit in this dialogue. For example, the distinction between moral action and production, or in Greek terms, between praxis and poiesis, imminent act and transitory or productive act. Moral action is praxis, an imminent act because it shapes the agent themselves and remains within the agent. Committing injustice, even if it may bring external benefits, actually destroys the agent from within. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world if he loses himself? No, wait, that's from somewhere else. A small note to conclude: Socratic ethics or classical ethics in general is usually contrasted with utilitarianism or consequentialism, which essentially claims that the moral value of an action lies solely in its consequences. But I don't find this opposition entirely accurate because, fundamentally, Socratic ethics is also an ethics of consequences, the consequences that a particular act has on my soul. We could say that consequentialism is true in principle, we must consider the consequences, but wrong in its application. It doesn't get the relevant consequences right, it doesn't correctly identify which consequences give moral value to an action. Of course, we must consider the consequences, but above all, we must consider the primary consequence: what am I becoming if I do this? What happens to me, to my soul, is also a consequence of my action. In fact, it is the consequence that should be considered above all others. In this sense, classical ethics would be true consequentialism. But, well, what do you think? Do you agree with Socrates? Would you prefer to commit an injustice or suffer one? Leave your answers in the comments. And, as always, if you liked the video, give it a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe, it's free.